Berube from Berube Consulting. He offered to speak about a topic he spoke at the MySQL user conference, the Corona Live user conference, which I thought was pretty cool. And the topic is actually pretty interesting, increasing MySQL performance through aggressive data archiving. So that's all I really have to say. Take it away, David.
Sounds good. So imagine with me for a moment that you don't clean your apartment ever. Now, some of you are probably saying, what do you mean imagine? But seriously, imagine for a moment that your house or apartment, you just don't clean it, right? So as you go about your routine, you have more and more trash that builds up and you put out to the side, right? You buy more books and different things and you kind of place them in piles, right? Now if you think about that for a second, you probably could live your life that way, right? Now as you had more and more stuff that built up through years of acquiring stuff, it would get harder to find something. You'd have to dig through all sorts of stuff to find it. You probably would eventually find it, but it would get in the way. And as you got more stuff, everything you did would slow down, right? Now, you say to yourself, I wouldn't do that to my apartment, right? I'd take up the trash, right? I'd throw away my possessions at least occasionally, but, and that's probably true. We wouldn't do that to our home or office. However, we often do something very similar to our databases. Many companies don't have archiving in place, right? What often happens is even suggest it, you get blowback because business people often view that as a detriment, not a feature. So very often what we do is we have databases and then performance gets unacceptable and we move to a larger server, right? Or we shard, we do clusters, or we do shards and clusters and cloud this and all sorts of things. That's much like you filling up your apartment and then moving to a bigger apartment, then moving to a warehouse, right? Now, at some point you might need a bigger house, but if you don't throw things away, that point is going to come a lot sooner. The same thing's true with databases. Every database, on a very basic level, is composed of data structures, right? Usually they're pretty similar. Sometimes you run across something a little unusual. But generally speaking, and actually I should say universally speaking, big data structures are slow data structures. You take any database product out there, right? Take a simple table structure, a complex one, fill it with one row, probably going to be performant. Same thing's true, couple hundred rows. Fill it with 100 million rows, going to be a lot less performant, and everywhere in between, right? Many of you have seen the graphs where you have where the working data set exceeds the size of the available memory, and then inter-DB performance goes way downhill. Same thing's true of pretty much any other database out there, database engine. Now, you try and do things different ways, right, so that point gets delayed. But basically, big data structures are slow data structures. For the same reason that as you get more stuff in your apartment, it's harder to get things done. So you're inserting a new row in a table, right? You have to update the indexes, do these different things. A lot more data to sort through. A much bigger tree. When the tree is smaller, it's going to go a lot faster. The other point, the additional point is that if you can keep things in working memory, because memory is so much faster than long-term storage, hard drives, that is additional. So, but even beyond that point, the smaller the structure is, the faster it's going to go. What are the consequences if you don't archive, if you hoard data, right? Or if you don't archive enough? Well, obviously we talked about increased hardware costs, right? One of the things that's less obvious is maintenance windows often become longer. So you have to modify your schema. Things take longer because you have more data. If you have small tables, it's very, very quick, instant to do that, right? And the longer the maintenance windows are, obviously the longer you have to pay techs, but perhaps more importantly, the harder it is to schedule them. It's very easy to say the system is going to be down for 4 minutes, 4 a.m. Saturday morning. It's really hard to say the site's going to be down Saturday and Sunday all day. A lot harder to say that. We often use optimization, performance tuning, as something we do to diagnose problems, right? So, okay, now the system is too slow, let's make it faster, right? But the less we archive, the more we have to do that. The more times we have problems. If we keep the data down, it is amazing how many of these performance-related things become less of a priority because the entire system basically becomes faster. Even if we say, the last bullet point is that at any given price point, the system is going to be slower. Even if we say price is not an object, I don't know, or maybe I shouldn't say it's not an object, it's not a severely limiting factor for our situation, right? It still is a factor. So for any given amount of money you're spending, if you properly archive and have a good strategy that makes sense, your system's going to be faster and more reliable if you have a proper archiving strategy in place. So we've often heard people say that more hardware is the secret sauce, and that's true. There is no ultimately substitute for more hardware, but it's also true that less data is a secret sauce. If you can reduce the amount of data you're working with, you're going to be able to get away with less hardware, right? Just as you can't add an infinite amount of hardware, you also can't reduce your data set to zero, or at least not and still be useful. But the more you can have less data, the better. So, saying that is easy, but as technical people, we don't generally get a chance to just make policy decisions and implement them, right? It's a lot harder than that. We have to be able to justify things, and if we're going to do that, we have to have the data to back that up. So let's go over a few things that we often have to ask ourselves and different people on our staff. The first fundamental question is, when does this data become stale, right? In some applications, this is obvious. With any given set of data, at some point, it becomes acceptable to have much higher latency, right? For example, we look at Google results. The first couple pages, it's really important for it to load fast. If you're on page 150, you're probably very invested in that search result. Probably doesn't matter as much if it goes a little bit slower, right? Likewise, if you're on browsing eBay, right? They're going to want their front page to go real fast, searches for things to go real fast. If you're looking for historical data on what Brooks Brothers shirts sold for 4 years ago, right? You're probably an eBay seller, and you probably have more patience than that guy who has an itchy trigger finger and wants to spend money right now. So depending on the kind of data, right, it's going to become stale. And one of the questions is, which should be on here, but strangely isn't, is at what point can we just throw the data away, if ever, right? So it may be that certain data you can just get rid of and you don't need it at all. And if that's not the case, can we access it with a higher latency, right? For example, one of the things you can do is having an archive table with automatic failover. So the system goes something like, there's a primary key lookup on, say you're on eBay, you're looking up an item, the primary key lookup, okay, I can't find it, let's check the archive table. Then you can let that get huge and sprawling, right? And then you say, if the person's looking at old stuff, it's probably acceptable. In this case, once the item has been sold, a higher latency is acceptable. You might say, if it's been sold and it's been sold for 3 years, maybe it has an exceptionally high latency tolerance, right? Obviously, it depends on your particular model, right? And in some cases, well, even having a latency, you might say, well, there's going to be a delay. Maybe you've seen sites pull up, say, oh, accessing your data as a progress bar, right? In some cases, seconds would be reasonably acceptable. You say 10 seconds if someone looking at some very old data. Other cases might be minutes. You might even be able to get away with hours, right? Sometimes you've seen results like for account history longer than 30 days, please send us an email at, right? That sort of thing. Which brings us into our next point. If you can have a strategy for unarchiving data, and a good one, often it increases what people are willing to consider acceptable. We just talked about, sometimes you can say, okay, we only retain data for a year, right? But if you need data longer than that, it's in our long-term records. Give us an email or a phone call or whatever. And then people, often it isn't the actual ability to access the data that they need. It's that comfort that knowing they could access the data if it becomes important, right? If we have legal reasons or what have you, or a public relations disaster, something like that. Conversely, sometimes just having the ability, even if you have a limited feature set, just having the ability to pull up the data at all for reference, right? Maybe say, okay, this isn't searchable except by primary key, right? You can't do these following 10 things, right? I know Slashdot actually turns their old pages into static HTML, so you can view the, at least it did at one point, I don't know if they still do, I haven't read Slashdot in a while. But, so it's static HTML, you can read all the comments, you can read the story, you just can't do any functionality. All it is just a static page on a hard drive someplace. So depending on your feature set, it's going to vary a lot, but Usually you can find some kind of middle ground, right? Where for a certain set of data, it's instantly available full speed. For a certain set of data, maybe you have automated, possibly even transparent to the user, where it simply accesses a bigger and slower table, right? And for a certain set of data, you can say, no, you need to manually intervene, right? In some cases, maybe you don't even tell the users and just keep it in case that you get a subpoena or something, right? So the last bullet point is can be mixed based on arbitrary criteria. Obviously, I can't tell you all the different ways you might slice it, but there's a lot of different ways you can. And if you come up with a good and smooth way that fits in with the user's perceptions of pulling data back from the abyss, right, it's going to make users a lot more comfortable with whatever archiving is going on. So the next question, obviously, is where you're going to archive the data to, which seems simple at first, but in fact, there's a lot of different answers depending on what your application is. The obvious answer is just blow the data away when you're done with it and have backups. For a lot of cases, this isn't going to work, but if it will work for you, it's going to be pretty simple. Another great possibility is keeping it in MySQL, right? In a MySQL table, either on the same server or on a different server, right? Even if you isolate the tables to the same, if you have the tables on the same server, you still will have some benefit because your working table is going to be stored all in memory all the time. Obviously, it's not great to be swapping a huge archive table to and from the disk, but it definitely is workable, particularly if you're not hitting the archive table all the time. And if you have them both in MySQL, it's very easy to do hot swaps between live and archive. Obviously, depending on the size of your data set. It can be a little tricky if you're unarchiving hundreds of objects every time a user clicks on something. So like we said, you have to look at how much data you're transferring back and forth all the time, but it is a great solution. Not a big fan of this next bullet point, flat files. People do it. Some people really like CSV, and some people like XML more than me, which is to say they like it at all. Not a huge fan of XML, but it does work. One of the last things you mentioned is NoSQL. These solutions can work well because it's really easy to archive something to something like MongoDB because it's so flexible. That is great for solutions where you want to have the data, and you'd like to be able to do querying on it, but it's not super high priority because it's very easy to jump structured data of almost any sort in MongoDB, and then do queries even on nested objects in it. So in some cases, you can even do things like storing a completely different structure where you're just taking your entire ORM representation of your object and just throwing that in the MongoDB, serializing into a hash, and then it comes back up the other end. The nice thing about that, compared to something like a SQL backup or a flat file, is then you can do ad hoc querying on it, and you can keep old copies without having to update the structure. Because when you use a table, one thing I didn't mention is you have to make sure that you're keeping the structures of the two things in sync. And I've actually recommended people use, like, if you're using automated testing, having like a functional, or I heard people call them functional and unit test, but whatever. An automated test of some kind to say, okay, this is the mothball roles table. How does that compare to the structure of the roles table? A lot of times people do not check the output of cron jobs very regularly, and by that I mean most people never check the output of cron jobs. So it's entirely possible to have your mothball processes just failing, where it's saying mismatched number of rows or columns, excuse me, and they're just failing silently in the background, and your tables are growing, and you don't realize it. As an aside, it's nice to Percona has a script on our website which actually each day will go through all of your tables and log the number of rows in it. You can do something very similar with a ton of other solutions, right? Cacti, it's pretty easy to do stuff like that. If you're keeping an eye on the total number of rows that you have systemically, that's something that helps to detect that kind of error, because it's very easy to have these things fail silently and nobody notice. And unlike backups, they don't have that fear of losing your job. Hopefully as IT professionals, we're smart enough to realize that if the backups don't happen and there's an emergency, we're going to need to dust off our resumes real quick, right? The same thing doesn't happen with archiving jobs, so we don't always feel the same priority. So watching out for that kind of thing is important. The last point is nowhere. Certain types of data you can just throw away. Obviously, you have to be careful of that because business people have been known to tell you you can throw away certain types of data and then change their minds, and unthrowing things away tends to be hard. Still, it is definitely a possibility. Like we talked about eBay earlier, if you're making an auction site and you have unaccepted bids, well, that's probably not super useful data after a certain period of time. No one really cares that they almost won a TV back in 2007. Or maybe they do, depends on your application, I guess. One of the things I like to say is, can this data be outsourced, right? In some cases, you can take entire classes of problems and just give them to somebody else, right? The great thing about this, for example, is if your MySQL server is no longer storing your web analytics data, all of that memory and disk space can be used towards keeping something important in working memory, right? So if you say, okay, we're not doing all analytics anymore, we're doing Google Analytics or whatever, right? Then that's memory that you're using for something else. So if you can do that, that's great. Convincing people to do that sometimes is hard, but if you can, obviously at a reasonable cost, that's a great way to go. So fitting your archiving strategy to business needs. So once you have an answer you like, right, say we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Sometimes you talk to the business people, I mentioned a few times, and your plan doesn't survive as well as you like, right? I think it was it Patton that said no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy? So one of the things that happens a lot is you talk to your manager or even your manager's manager, and they say, no, we can't do this, right? The customers won't allow it. Very often, that's not really true. So what happens is you have the initial conversation, you say, I'd like to do this, and they say, okay, yeah, that's great, but it's really not that important, right? And the clients, they won't put, a lot of times they view data retention as another bullet point that's very easy to extend. We store data for 10 years, you don't have to worry about it, right? But if you can give, like it says here, give detailed justification to say, if we do this, we believe we'll get this kind of speed boost benefit, we can reduce our future costs, then people are going to be people making decisions are going to be a lot more apt to talk to the end users and really figure out what they are not going to put up with. One of the things I like to suggest to people, you see a lot more, especially in the cloud service companies, is using data retention as part of your pricing model. Because I find that amazingly, people, when you say, oh yeah, I can absolutely retain that data, it'll just cost you, then they say, you know what, I never use stuff of more than 6 months old, it's fine, don't worry about it. As soon as I have to pay for it. So if you can convince them to do that, that's great. Like I said, the last bullet point says the management and the technical people should work closer together. If that's not true at your company, get another job. You do not work at a good company. So I mentioned earlier, a lot of times, particularly if you're working in retail, you have non-completed transactions, right? For example, you have all this session data or different things on things that didn't actually happen, or users who didn't actually buy something, or canceled transactions for whatever reason. This talks about unaccepted bids, right? If you're on a social networking site and you reject somebody as a friend, well, that might be useful data for 30 days because you don't want somebody spamming someone over and over again, but you probably don't need it 2 years down the line, right? That someone rejected a friend request. Or if you're doing it, maybe you can store less data or what have you, right? So a lot of times, things that didn't happen are something that you can easily just get rid of and not store anymore. One of the other things that's true is aggregated data. A lot of times when users say, I need to know X, a lot of times they don't need to know specifically about X, right? A lot of times they can make whatever decision they're going to be making with aggregated data. Web analytics is a real great example of that. You might want to know something about your traffic loads, right, hour by hour, but you probably don't need to know specifically 6 years ago, a one hour period on a Friday probably doesn't matter. Almost all of this stuff is very general, in your particular case, there's situations where you can throw away data that would seem surprising, and when you have to keep data that would seem surprising. If you're doing things with highly specific legal requirements, that's going to change everything. It definitely depends on the field you're in, but even often in highly specific situations, you can archive it to something slower, and you don't need to have it in your working data. A lot of times you can use archive to a disk that isn't accessed very often, pretty interchangeably with just delete. Definitely depends what you're doing. If you are thinking about, your company's thinking about starting a legal action, evidence against, Bob J. Monopolist probably has a longer shelf life than if you are Bob J. Monopolist, right? But in general, for some types of services, you can aggregate data very successfully. Web analytics is a great example. Performance data is another great example. For example, if you're familiar with New Relic, has a great service for doing performance analytics. Really like their stuff. I've used it a lot for Ruby on Rails. And they also have offerings for PHP and Java. And again, as I mentioned earlier, they roll their data retention into their pricing model. And it's something like you get so many days of real time, hour by hour, and then it's aggregated after that. Right? But the truth is, you probably don't need to know. You might have some needs, right? Like the client said, why did this go slow at noon last week when I was doing X, right? But you probably don't need to know, okay, 5 years ago, what did it look like for this 40-second time frame? Probably don't need to know that. At the very least, if you do need to know that, you can say to the management, this is why we need a zillion servers and we're paying a gazillion dollars a month because we have this ridiculous requirement. So if we can change that, we'll pay half a gazillion dollars a month instead of a full gazillion. It's also interesting to know that in some cases, you can store one example record and then aggregate the rest. Highly dependent on your data model because not everything fits as neatly. But, for example, if you send out a marketing email to 100 zillion people, right, and each one says, dear so-and-so, we have this amazing deal for you. You probably don't need to store all 80 million copies of it personalized with their name and whatever else, right? A few representative rows, or maybe if you have 10 different types going on, you send 10 representative rows, whatever. If you can do that, you're going to save it, in some cases, pretty dramatic amounts. If you use an error service like Airbreak, used to be called Hoptoad, I think, or Exceptional. Is that what's called Exceptional? They do that, right? They don't store full stack trace on every error that, this thing got hit 100,000 times in the last hour, just throwing out the same error page. They store a couple, and the rest, it just says, by the way, this happened another 100,000 times. So if you can do that, that's a big win. I already talked about this because I'd forgotten what was in my notes and what order I was supposed to talk about things. But if you can encourage things through pricing, that works great because you're taking something that's a disadvantage and turning it into additional money, which is great for our job stability because companies with more money tend not to go out of business and you still have a job, which is nice. The flip side of what I mentioned earlier is even though users often really don't need data retention, if you can use it to upsell. If you get the super premium account, which at times the very highest tier, it's hard to find features that make sense. A lot of times, I get that last couple dollars out of people with a lot of money. Data retention can be something that works well. That way they get peace of mind in exchange for paying you an extra of XYZ dollars a month. That's all great. That's different ways we can do it and different ways we can tell people this is why we should do it. But actually implementing it a little more complicated than that. A few things I can talk about. So the ideal thing, if you can swing it, is to archive during a down period. A lot of times that's not plausible, right? A lot of companies work 24/7 now. But if you are in a business-to-business environment, a lot of times you can, particularly if it's more or less based in short range of time zones, find some time when we're at a pretty low usage rate. For example, banks famously after hours will do all sorts of batch processes. Right? If you ever worked for a lot of financial services company, markets close or it's 6 o'clock, whatever the magic time is, and they do all kinds of stuff every night. Right? Billing stuff works like that a lot of times. If you can do that, it's great. The really nice thing about a downtime window is the atomicity of archiving is trivial. As long as you're done by the time the window is over, it's atomic, right? assuming you're not doing other conflicting things with your batch processes, right? The disadvantage is it's frequently not compatible with business needs. This is particularly true for consumer stuff. Consumers often want to be able to access things 24/7, right? Facebook is not going down 4 a.m. every morning, right? People are still playing whatever they play on Facebook. The last bullet point under downtime is it says monitoring processes. It is surprising how often people will have processes that continue spiraling out of control after downtime. So, man, why is this site still going slow? You find out it's still archiving or backing up or processing data from 3 o'clock this morning, and nobody paid attention to how long it took. I mentioned earlier about no one following cron jobs. Disastrously true. So if you do have some way to make sure that these things are actually happening, that's important. The alternative is what we often have to do, archiving on a live site, right? But a lot of times we can find periods that, people are on there, but it's a lot less active. It's a semi-live period, right? So you say, okay, we're not taking the site down, but we're going to say the performance is a little bit worse. We're shutting all this data down, right? A lot of times people don't complain if your website is slow at 4:30 in the morning. So this is a very naive approach to archiving data, right? So we insert into an archive table, then we delete what we just inserted. Yes, the first problem is that these are two different statements. So the time is going to change. If this happens very quick, right, a 100th of a second, or it's not going to matter. But if it happens very quick, you don't have to be doing this anyway, so it doesn't matter. So if this takes say 10 minutes to run the first command, then we have a 10-minute window where all those bids are going to get deleted that weren't archived yet, right? It's not the end of the world unless it actually is the end of the world, in case those were 10 important minutes. So very easy to make mistakes like that when you just say, okay, I know how to delete things 30 days older. I know how to write that where query. Very easy to make that mistake, right? This is a much better approach where we just use date literals. The problem with this approach is that there's a lot of locking going on, right? If you have 100,000 rows going on, you're going to have this huge, humongous lock going on, potentially take your system down. The big problem that we find usually is not the deleting or the inserting. It's the guarantees of atomicity on that many rows at a time. InnoDB is great, but it's not great enough where we can just where it's going to be highly performant when you're trying to get a lock on 500,000, a million rows at a time. That's a very expensive operation. So if you can avoid that, that's important, because if you just do this as it is, once you get into large amounts of data, what's going to happen is while you're doing that, if the operation even succeeds, it's going to pretty much take your site down. Not a guarantee, but it does happen a lot. So that's why we don't do that. So, problem may involve locking huge numbers of rows, which is bad. The alternative, logically enough, is stepping through the result set. So you say, okay, we're going to archive this 10,000 at a time, then move that over, right? The problem with that is it is a reasonably complex implementation, right? I mentioned earlier about the guide posts. Easy to make mistakes like that when you're implementing something like that, and that's a problem because we mentioned several times in this talk about no one monitoring cron jobs. The way you found out that you made a mistake in implementing your custom archiving routine is when you lose your job, or about 2 days before you lose your job, right? So if we can avoid implementing our own, that's much better. So there are a few tools available for doing this kind of thing. The first one, very limited, but if you use a backup tool, right? We talked earlier about that, just using a backup tool, then just deleting whatever you have. Easy enough, usually unacceptable, but easily enough. One of the great solutions we're gonna talk about shortly is using PT Archiver. That's the Percona Toolkit Archiver. It's great. It's well tested. It's used by a ton of people. It's very performant. It's very good at you give it a where clause, and it's very good at taking those reasonably sized chunks, moving them over, and it's battle tested, so you're reasonably likely that you're not going to blow away a whole ton of data, or at least there's a lot less stuff to diagnose if you're worried about that. There are proprietary solutions for doing this, not real familiar with them, But if you just wave some money around on some database vendors, they probably will give you some stuff that may or may not work reasonably well. Of course, there are cases where pre-built solutions don't work, and you do have to spend the time and go custom. The last thing, mentioned briefly, there is something called an archive table. It has a raft of limitations. I have not seen any practical use for it. It's a storage engine in MySQL where it's I want to say it's read-only, I forget, to be honest with you. It has a raft of limitations.
It's insert only.
Is
You
there
can't
insert
update
only?
it, it's insert only, and I think you can have like a primary key and that's it. You
Yeah.
can't have any other like, indexes, so you can't just add a table to it or something like that.
I think its big selling point is it's compressed, as I recall, on disk.
Yeah.
But-
through compressed data.
It's
Yeah.
one step above a packed MyISQL table, but
Yeah,
a very
it's
small
not-
step above it.
It's not great, so it's generally implausible, but since that has the word archive in it, and this talk has the word archive in it, I figured I'd briefly mention it. So, yeah, one of the things that, any time in technology, you're using stuff that a lot of people aren't, you run that risk of something oddball happening. I was working with a content management system, which I did not like, the client had, and but I posted in Google Groups where the functionality the previous developer had used, the guys were like, "Oh, people are still using that?" I'm like, thinking this was probably not patched to fix it. So when you get off that beaten path, it does increase the danger, which is what's great about PT Archiver is it's very on the beaten path and well maintained and reliable software. So, short example of how a PT Archiver works, right? You can set, we have a very secure password, username. So yeah, it has its own DSL, which is reasonably simple. Right? It says -- source, and it says target equals bids, or target table equals bids. The database, which is capital D, is test database, and then it has a destination. You can also override these, so I believe you can copy from one database to another. It has some it doesn't only talk to MySQL databases, so you can't actually use this to archive to a flat file. Probably not much point in doing so, but if you did want to step through, like MySQL backup does cause some performance issues at times. Extra backup is better, but then again, the form you get from extra backup is not as much fun. So you can use this to archive to other things as well. And obviously it takes a nice little SQL fragment at the end. So you can say, where, this and that. And there's a million other options to PT Archiver too, which will be thoroughly, painfully detailed by the man page, if you so desire.
Can that archive to another instance?
I'm sorry?
Can that archive to another instance?
Yes. Yeah, I didn't detail it, but you can, I don't know what it is off the top of my head. I want to say it's capital H equals the host name, something like that. It'll all be in the man page. And as you increase in complexity and that kind of stuff, it's nice to know that other people have done this exact same thing using this exact same tool. So one of the things that does happen is it's a lot easier to talk about archiving one table than it is to talk about archiving an entire system, right? Usually you don't have the situation where you have one huge enormous table that has all of your data, right? Because things are normalized, right? The only problem with that is that you have a lot of relationships between these tables. So once you start archiving one table, you're in a situation where you have a whole ton of broken links between these other tables, right? So you have maybe, we talked about auctions earlier, eBay, you have a whole ton of bids which are no longer associated with an active item or perhaps with an active seller, right? Now ideally, the data you're archiving is not being used by a ton of people, right? So it's not a big problem, but it still is an issue. So if you can, the best thing to do it is still to archive the tables one at a time. PT Archiver doesn't do archiving a whole ton of tables at once. And when you're taking the bigger chunks of data and the more tables you accessing at once, the harder it's going to be to make sure that things are atomic and that you're not breaking anything in between. It's going to be harder for InnoDB to get all those logs at the same time, and you're going to have more issues. But one of the things that can happen, and this is extremely dependent on your application, sometimes you can start at the top of your schema and work your way down, right? So for example, if you have, I keep using the example of eBay. If you have an item, you archive the items first. People probably don't have a ton of URLs pointing specifically to one bid and not referencing the item, Like you're probably usually going to hit, your data system's going to hit the item first, then say the bids, and then the pictures, and then whatever else you have associated with that, right? So if you can work from the top down, a lot of times you can find that this isn't an issue. It's extremely dependent on your application and how resistant it is to having missing objects. But if you can do that, that's great, right? But if you absolutely do need the ability to archive a whole ton of tables and make sure you don't have any missing dependencies between them, it is possible, but you're going to have to do a lot more of that logic yourself, which is outside the scope of this talk. So that's pretty much what I got. Any questions?
You looked at Oak Chunk Update, I think it's called.
I have not. Is that by the same guy who, he also has a schema tool? Right?
Yeah, that's Shlomi's, yeah. He has the
Yeah.
OpenArc toolkit, and it won't archive everything, but if you already have the data somewhere else, you can delete by chunks or update by chunks, either way.
Yeah, he's a interesting guy. I know I would have liked the schema change
schema.
tool,
Yeah.
but I haven't worked with this stuff a ton. Yeah, but yeah, there are other tools out there. I'm a big fan of PT Archiver, but there are definitely other tools out there. But almost everything that I've seen, the way it works is pretty much the same. You take a chunk, migrate it over, make sure that it's transactional enough that you don't have you're not just doing any of the dumb things that I did earlier. So that you're ensure that if this, you lose your connection halfway through, you're not going to lose data. So that's pretty much the way most of those work.
One good way also I've found is to partition things, especially if you don't need it, if you don't need to archive it. You can partition by month or whatever, and then you have a script that runs. I think Palomino DB has some automatic scripts that you can use where, if you want to add a partition every month, so they have the thing where you can run a script, so you can run it from cron that every week you make sure that it has at least 3 months out or something like that. And then you can do an Agios check, which they have also, to make sure that you have at least 2 months out in the check, right? So the script is ahead of the check, and if it ever gets behind, you find out, 2 months ahead of time that, there was a problem as opposed to the day after there was supposed to be. And the same thing on the other side, you can delete stuff that's, just drop the partitions that are too old, and then you don't have that problem of deleting. You just have to wait for the file to delete off of the file system.
Huh?
Is it possible to keep different partition on different media, like tape, for example?
Theoretically, yes. In reality, it's not such a good idea. I mean, it depends. You can, with MySQL partitioning, you can partition my ISIM tables. So in that case, for sure, right? Because you just copy files over. With DB, it gets trickier because of the data dictionary. So it's not something I would try, but theoretically, it is.
I've heard people talk about it, but I don't know if anyone's actually
Yeah.
done it in practice. You can do all sorts of unholy things with, symbolic links and such, but I'm not sure you actually should do some of those things.
Right.
I do believe that the High Performance MySQL book has some stuff about trying to move things onto other partitions and symlink them over. I don't remember the details. But
It has the book, right?
the way I remember it is it's generally less than amazing. Do you have a question?
Well, I was going to point out that NODB has MVCC concurrency mode, so you can do a sweep, and if the only thing you're deleting are instances out of a single table, then you can archive the data from the foreign key relationships and have a clean snapshot within each transaction. So there's no.
Well, one of the things, yeah, definitely. One of the things is the more you have the MVCC engine do, the more chance you're going to have an issue happening in between and it gets rolled back. But
But you don't need to do the entire archiving in one sweep.
It's true.
Because if
You-
you're archiving by chunk, and then you miss one because the
Yeah.
transactions overlap something else,
a-
it's okay to miss one, to get them the next time through.
It's true.
But you don't want the other way around where you archive stuff and then you delete stuff later than what you archived.
No, you have to delete within the same transaction,
Right.
but since you're only doing reads for the foreign key lookups, that shouldn't.
Yeah, a lot of times people don't have that set up though. A lot of times people don't have any kind of validation on the foreign keys. So whether they should or not is a holy war for somebody else. But most of my clients don't have, cascading deletes or Or
The
you-
bigger problem is the archive table itself is now a wide table with data from all the lookups added to it.
Yeah, because you only have one target as opposed to a
You
bunch of
can't-
targets.
You can't
Yeah.
reconstruct the target table.
Yeah,
because
depending
time
on-
stuff won't match.
Yeah, depending on your situation, that may be a bigger or smaller problem. In some cases, it's very valid just to have a read-only or reduced functionality archive table. It's hard to say. You know, it just totally depends on what your exact situation is.
Is it possible to use volume manager for archiving?
It depends. Not in any kind of automatic way that I'm familiar with. Usually, you're going to want to keep all. Well, I don't want to be. I don't want to be too general and bite off more than I can chew
It is
here.
not a common solution, but
You can. I mean, I know people who. Keep part. I have heard of situations where they keep part of it, like their table definitions, on a different partition than the other part of it. But generally speaking, all of the actual data in a table should be on the same partition. Is the guideline I've been told, but I haven't played with enough to know for sure. I can say that if you run into a problem, it's going to likely to be a complicated problem that's going to be all kinds of fun to fix.
because people do use that for backups.
Yes, I mean,
Right, which
as
is
long
why
as you're
you
not.
put them on the same partition because you want consistent backups. So you don't want to take a backup if you're using like an LVM snapshot or something
Yeah.
like a snapshot, right? It stops, stops everything for a split second, gets a read on the data and then, keeps going while it then copies the snapshot. If you have two different partitions, like let's say you have your binary logs and your data on a different partition, when you go to restore, let's say, that server, then your binary logs may not be in the same position that your data was.
Right, but if you just back up your partition where you have everything and convert it like into a file, which could be done, so you can store that file and use it kind of create a periodical procedure and.
Yeah, we talked about latency. That's going to be a high latency process, but it's definitely workable. Extra Backup is another tool from Percona. It's very good at doing snapshot backups, as I recall. And there's a ton of other proprietary tools to do the kind of thing. And I believe you can do it just with standard Linux file system tools as well. So it's definitely doable. Like you take a point in time snapshot and whole 9 yards. That's absolutely doable. In fact, any backup process, you can then follow it with delete and turn it into an archive process.
There's just one problem. If you're looking for a record that went away,
Yeah,
you don't know when it went away. There could be a lot of historical backups to it.
Yeah, it's not that's not going to be compatible with any kind of easy, smooth fall over.
So you'd have to create some sort of extra custom lookup.
Yeah, one of the things you can
That
even.
usually resolves itself because you usually have some kind of unique key on the data, and if you don't, you have an auto increment, and the auto increments go in order. So if you know you're missing record 1, 2, 3, 4, but you have 1, 2, 3, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 3, you can have times. You know what I mean? You have kind of timestamps so you can kind
Someone's
of
looking
see.
for data that they want. Do they ask for the auto incremented key or do they ask for the customer name?
Yeah, there's other approaches too, though. There's other approaches too. Like sometimes what will happen is the main record, you can keep that in a small form. Say, for example, just a few flags and ID numbers, right, and other data, and then have the bulk of it in a different table that you archive, right? So you have a list of project names or invoice names that has the customer and different data. You just leave that for a very long time, maybe even forever, because it's going to be very small.
But I think you alluded to that earlier. You have to think through the scenarios of when you might need to raise the zombie.
Yeah. And you do have to be careful.
What you know at that point.
There is a school of thought that I've occasionally told people is that I try and go a little bit further, whatever the business needs to. So if they say you're never going to need this data, if you can, keep a backup of it anyway, without, what I'm saying, obviously without spending a bunch of people's money without telling them. That's good, because a lot of times they say we're never going to need this, and then you need it. So if you can avoid deleting data, that's better. But in the real world, it's hard to say, I want all this money for S3 storage because I don't believe you. That does not go over well with people.
But even when you say the main record, let's say a customer record, right? So I know in the old systems, old 30 years old, when they start in business, when the customer, let's say you say I'm going to keep the customer record forever, but I haven't seen many systems where they kept the changes. Let's say the customer say, I want to, oh, by the way, my street name, it's not William, it's Williams, okay? You don't keep those changes, right? So by the time you reproduce that, you don't have a timestamp, you don't have all of these things. You cannot really say you keep just a little stamp. If you really, unless you say this thing ever never change, you cannot say that, because even companies get acquired and all these kind of underlying relationship get changed. So in that sense, if you say that you keep that, meaning that you keep a number of variations of that, not only you cannot say really a root data not changing, because, you know.
That's actually a benefit of flattening data to a different form,
Right.
if you can. Because, for example,
But then
I mentioned
the volume you
yeah,
produce is larger
it is,
in terms of
can be
bytes.
unfortunate.
You-
So when I mentioned Slashdot earlier,
Yeah.
the nice thing about that is you have that page as it appeared. Right? For example, this is a minor example, doesn't really matter, but often you have online forums, people change their nicknames, right? But there's an old thread where someone's making a joke about somebody's nickname, which now makes absolutely no sense because his nickname is now the Incredible Bob instead of whatever it was before, right? That's a trivial example. But you might have situations where you have an invoice, an archived invoice, which has the same customer ID, is still there. They got acquired 3 times, now they're part of IBM, but they weren't back in 2004. So depending on your business needs, that can change. But there's a lot to be said for archiving alternate forms, like printable forms and stuff like that, especially for legal purposes, because judges don't like it if you say, this is what we got from our system and it doesn't match what they get from the other guy. That tends to be, you know what I'm saying? As technical people will say, oh, the records are the same. But creating something tomorrow might be different than when you created it yesterday.
I'm surprised you didn't put Michael Fisher.
It does happen. I mean, I tend to focus more on the performance aspects, but it is important to say that there are legal, I'm not an expert on them, there are important legal ramifications to when you archive and where. That's why a lot of times people, I mentioned outsourcing, a lot of times people outsource that part of it. Like if you have an email requirement for so long, you take this box and it intercepts all your email, stores it, and whatever, deletes it automatically. That's a great way to solve those kind of legal requirements, but the thing is, no matter what, depending on your schema and your business and legal environment, it's going to vary dramatically what you can and can't do. So those are the questions you want to ask, and that's kind of approach you want to take to it. But it is going to vary dramatically. For that matter, I mean, we talk about HIPAA and SOPA and all these different things, and Sarbanes-Oxley, but that's just American law. There's plenty of other legal environments on the planet. So, and depending where you're at, it is going to vary.